Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I hope you have had a wonderful weekend. I hope you've been able to do something that brings you joy, whether that's reading, as I always want you to be doing, but it doesn't have to be reading. It could be doing something else, walking, binge watching, any number of things. I had a productive weekend, a non-productive weekend. Is it terrible that I can't remember which it was? I mean, it must have been productive. I know I got stuff done, but I can't remember what it was, so it couldn't have been terribly exciting. And really, do you want to hear that I got laundry done? Actually, you know what? I do have to brag on myself a little bit because not this weekend, but last week I did laundry. And I actually folded the laundry and put it away the same day that I washed and dried it. It's true. It was like a miracle, a small, minor miracle in my life. It probably won't happen again for many months, but hey, you got to take your small victories where you can find them, right? So I hope that your weekend involved victories, whether small or large, and that you were able to get out or stay in and do something that you enjoy. Let's talk about books, specifically a book and an author. This episode, I'm speaking with author John McNally about his collection of short stories called The Fear of Everything. Yep, another collection of short stories, which is very cool. If you listen to the last episode, you know that I spoke with author Heather Mateos Sappenfield about her collection of short stories. These are a lot different, obviously, because they're written by a completely different person. And you who are regular listeners know my complicated relationship with short stories. Maybe it's really not that complicated. Maybe I am just making it seem more complicated than it is. But John actually gave me some insight into why maybe I feel this way about short stories. I mean, I think I knew this, but he put it into a phrase that really resonated with me. He said that short stories are like catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye. And I thought, oh my gosh, yes, that is exactly what short stories are. And I think it's a quote from someone else, but if he may say it in the interview, so keep an ear out for that and see if he does say who that quote is from or if that quote is from him. I don't know. I don't remember. And I didn't look it up. I apologize. But yeah, short stories are like catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye. And for me, I don't like to just catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I want to know what it was that I saw. I want to have that whole picture. And so for me, short stories are wanting more. I always want, if I like a character, if I like their story, then I usually want to know more. I mean, I've said this on more than one occasion that I am the type of person who would be more than happy to have an epilogue to each book that gives me the next 50 years of each character's lives so that I know even more beyond the entire full-length novel what happens to the characters and their stories. So short stories, they're just they don't complete me. That's terrible. I'm sorry. That was a horrible joke. I apologize. You know what? Let me read you the back of the book because you want me to move on, right? Yes. All right. A magician shows up unexpectedly at a grade school. Retirees answer phone calls from lonely latchkey children. A sleep study assistant speaks to a patient about his own afterlife experiences. Richard Russo wrote of troublemakers. John McNally is an electrifying writer whose stories burrow under the skin. His world becomes our world, his way of seeing ours. Resistance is futile. The same is true of these 9 stories that are by turns fantastical, hilarious, and heartbreaking. So there you have it, the description of The Fear of Everything. Again, it is a collection of short stories by author John McNally. And we talk a little bit about the fact that I'm very glad that he did not start with the second story in the short story collection, because that one was a little tough for me to read, even tougher than my complicated relationship with short stories. I'm very glad that he started with The Magician, and there is a bit of an element of magical realism in that story, and kind of that one really actually sucked me in, and I was like, cool, a short story that has ended in a way that I feel like of course I want to know more, but I felt like I actually had enough and was mainly content with the way that one ran its course. So that was a fun experience for me. And then the next one I was like, whoa, and I don't want to tell you too much about the next story. It's called The Lawyer, and I mean, yeah, I can't tell you too much. I don't want to give too much away because, wow. See, John, you have made me just lose all of my trains of thought, as if I ever had any trains that were on actual tracks and not derailed. But that is a fun thing and a good thing. Let's turn to the interview, okay? I apparently the minor miracle of me actually folding laundry in a timely fashion has made it impossible for me to now complete full sentences. So that does not bode well for the rest of my week. But let's go ahead and turn to the interview with author John McNally. Again, the book is called The Fear of Everything.
Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
I am happy to have you here. We're here to talk about your collection of short stories called The Fear of Everything. Before we get to the stories, though, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. I grew up in Chicago. I write a lot about the Midwest. I've lived throughout the Midwest, and I currently live in southern Louisiana. I'm primarily a fiction writer. Been doing this for a long time, and I'm also a professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, where I teach mostly PhD students in the creative writing program here.
Fun. That sounds very interesting. Is it? I would assume it's something you enjoy. Is it challenging? And
yeah, I've been. I guess this is my 33rd year teaching, so I've been doing it for a long time. What's challenging this year is that we're still using Zoom, which we started last spring during the pandemic. So one thing I've realized, even though I'm an introvert for the most part, it's that I actually miss that human contact and actually being in the classroom. But yeah, I get to work on. I think like what probably the most satisfying thing, gratifying thing about working with PhD students is that I'm actually working on complete books, and so a handful of them have gone on to publish books shortly after graduation. So that's exciting to me, and also I don't have the same pressure of having to promote it or anything like that. So,
right.
I can just take pleasure in their successes.
It's kind of like having nieces or nephews. You can
right.
You
yeah,
can
it's all joy.
them and then,
it's not.
Yeah. I love that. So as I said, the book is called The Fear of Everything. Can you give an overview of the collection?
Sure. So it's 9 short stories, but I wrote over a 10-year period. Each of my short story collections took 10 years. So short story collections are kind of an odd thing in that that they're written over a fairly long period of time. So what I've done is I've actually looked at like what other people have said about it, because they probably have a better idea of it than I do in that sense. So when one reviewer called it Tales of Subtle Terror, and somebody else called it Tales of Suburban Unease. And a friend of mine referred to it as a collection venturing into the weird and uncanny with shades of Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury. And I think that's it, just to give a sense maybe tonally. Although I would add that I think a lot of my previous books had a lot of humor in them, and I think that there's still humor in this beneath the kind of subtle terror, but more kind of dark humor. And so there's also one thing that I'm doing in this collection that I hadn't done previously is that some of the stories have fantastical elements. I'm playing with form a little bit in them in ways that I hadn't before. There's a historical story in here, so I was trying to kind of play with genre in different ways. So on the one hand, it's kind of a grab bag of different kinds of stories, but I think those descriptions are pretty good umbrellas for most of the stories in the book.
I would agree. I think the subtle terror sort of resonated with me when thinking about the stories in the collection. It is called The Fear of Everything, and there is a short story called The Fear of Everything in the book. Did you have sort of a sense of that subtle terror in choosing the name of the book?
Well, I mean, once I got, like titling books is always kind of a challenge, because it's like trying to find something that tonally captures the book. And The Fear of Everything was one of the last stories that I wrote in the book, I think. It's one of the later stories. And it wasn't until I had that title that I was like, oh, okay, I had some other titles in mind before that, but then that one seemed like, oh, that actually kind of resonates for the entire book. Just that like slight paranoia that I think runs through the book. And also, I mean, I think that, I mean, we talk about this later, but it's like that the book has, like the theme of loss kind of runs through the book. And so I wanted something that also captured that, I don't know, I mean, a little bit of melancholy or a little bit of apprehension in some ways about you know, how the characters are feeling. So yeah, I mean, so that I felt, at least, you know, I'm glad that I ended up writing a story called The Fear of Everything, because that lent itself well to the title of the book.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to ask the inspiration for the collection, but if you wrote it over 10 years, maybe you didn't have an initial inspiration. I'll just flip that a little bit and say, where do you tend to get inspiration for your short stories?
Well, I mean, the nice thing about like books when they're written over a 10-year period is that, like, I can see the inspiration after the fact in some ways. And so, for example, when I began writing this book, I was going through a divorce. My father had died. I took a job that was 900 miles away, so I was leaving behind lots of friends. But I wasn't really conscious of the fact that I had all of this kind of collective loss that was going on pretty much in a fairly short period of time. So, and I always talk to my students about this, that when you're writing, it's like you want to try to get into that unconscious state where, you know, it's almost like a dream life that's informing your stories that you may not be aware of, like what actually, like, you know, where those ideas are coming from until later, until you can kind of have some distance from it. So it wasn't until I really had the book together that I thought that I looked back on it, and I think an early reader read the stories together and noticed that there was a lot of loss in it, and then I realized, like, oh, of course there would be, because of what I was going through in my life. So I guess what I would say is that the inspiration comes on unconscious level when I'm writing, because I think that's just kind of the process of how I write, which is trying to get inside the consciousness of the narrator as deeply as I can and tap into something. But then it does kind of function as, like I said, like a dream, where it's like it takes a while for it to kind of make sense, and it takes some distance to look back on it.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When I come back, John will be talking about whether or not there are any connections between the short stories in this collection. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with John McNally about his short story collection, The Fear of Everything. Let's go ahead and turn back to that interview.
When you write, there's definitely the connection of loss and the themes. Are there any other connections between the short stories? Do you ever sort of carry on a character or a setting when you're doing a separate short story?
I've done that in previous collections, especially my first collection. Had some recurring characters. This one I didn't. I think the one thing I tried to do in this one that I think was I was trying to push myself to do things I hadn't done. So either with form or with point of view. The first story is first person, plural. It's the we point of view. And I don't think I'd ever written in the we point of view before. So in that sense, I was inspired. It was more of kind of an, instead of like an emotional inspiration or a personal inspiration, it was more of like a technical inspiration of like trying to do something I hadn't done before. Mostly because right before I started this collection, I felt kind of burnt out on writing short stories. I'd written two of the short story collections over a 20-year period. I'd published probably about 60 short stories at that point, and I just thought, okay, I don't know what else to do with it. And then once I began writing the first story that ended up being part of this book, then I was kind of tapping back into like why I was writing in the first place, which was to have fun and to do, to explore different genres, but also to do kind of formal innovations by saying, okay, I'm going to have a story that's a triptych, or I'm going to have a story in a particular point of view. So that was exciting, and that kind of drove me to become more interested in the book.
Maybe this is an odd question, but do you select the order that the stories go in, or is that an editor, or how does that work?
I selected them. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever had an editor rearrange the order for me. Yeah. So yeah, I selected them.
Okay. I mean, because I was just thinking, I had a bit of whiplash when I started because the first story, The Magician, was really, really sucked me in, and I was drawn in, and then the second story, the lawyer just creeped me out, and so yeah. I was like, bit of I don't know, emotional whiplash between the first and the second story.
Well, yeah, and I probably should have put the lawyer a little further in, but I definitely wouldn't have begun with the lawyer, because I feel like the first story. I mean, that is what I try to do with the first story is it's like rolling out the welcome mat for the reader, and then once they get in, then I can surprise them with the next thing or unnerve them or whatever. So, but it's like it's hard. I always talk to my readers about this, as like establishing, or my students about this, about establishing a contract with the reader. And it's like the first story in a collection is a kind of contract, at least in terms of like, well, there may be some there are unnerving things that are in the first story, but it's a more welcoming story. But my hope is that, I'm setting a little bit of groundwork for something more disturbing to happen. So
yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, it's okay. Thank you for not putting the lawyer first, because I think I would have been like, I'm not so sure about the rest of this book.
Yeah.
Are there any, I mean, we just talked about a little bit about the magician and the lawyer. Are there any stories in particular that you would like to highlight from the collection?
I mean, I feel, well, actually, I was going to talk about the magician, but maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the phone call, because the phone call was the first story that I wrote for the book, before realizing it was going to be a book. And as I said, I was kind of burnt out on just writing short stories. And then a friend of mine was, he was editing a tribute anthology for Ray Bradbury. He was Ray Bradbury's official biographer, and he wanted to do this tribute anthology. And he already had lined up all these big names like Margaret Atwood, Neil Gaiman, Harlan Ellison, and he asked if I wanted to be in it. I was like, absolutely, I want to be in it. So, but then I was like, well, I don't really, mostly, pretty much everything I'd published, even though some of it was kind of a comic, it was in a realist mode. So I had to kind of think about, like, well, what would I do? And so with the phone call, what I remembered was 20 years earlier, maybe 23 years earlier, like in 1988, my mother died, and she was 54 years old. And I was really, really close to my mother. And about a year and a half after that, I was awake one night, and I just began writing a story called The Phone Call. And I stayed up all night, and I wrote it. So this would have been like 1990, 1991. And I printed it up with an old dot matrix printer. And it was a very cathartic story about, I don't think it was that good of a story, but it was a really cathartic story about just kind of dealing with my mother's death. But it was a grieving son who's trying to contact her and warn her about things. And the vehicle through which he does that is a phone. Anyways, I went to go look for the story a couple days later, and I couldn't find it. And for 20 years, I just kept thinking about that story, about like, well, maybe I should go back and write that story, or maybe I should write it as a screenplay, and I could never really settle on what to do until my friend gave me that assignment for the anthology. And I was like, well, actually, I mean, it's got a little bit of a Twilight Zone-ish aspect to it, and Ray Bradbury wrote for the Twilight Zone. So I decided to do that. And it was interesting because it's like I went back, and it's from memory, it was like it was a much denser, more complicated story that I wrote 20 years later. And I felt like I caught up to my ability to be able to write that kind of story that I tried earlier, and wrote it and sent it to my friend. And then when I was packing to move to Louisiana a couple of years later, I found the original version that I had lost 20 years prior. So, which in and of itself is almost kind of Bradbury-esque. But that's what really that set the tone then for the book, because Bradbury was somebody I read when I was a kid. And I didn't read that much as a child. I wasn't really a precocious kid in that sense. So, but I read some science fiction, and Ray Bradbury was somebody I read. And so I thought, well, what if I just write a book? What if I write a book that really kind of taps into why I began writing in the first place, which is to do all of these kinds of things that I might not have done in a previous collection. So
interesting. I love that you found that story 20 years later. When you read it, was it kind of what you remembered, or was it a lot different than what you remembered?
The DNA of it was there, and I was surprised at the similarities. There were a lot of things I didn't really change, and so again, it was just kind of from memory, being able to kind of access that and kind of stick to it. It's just that it's the newer version is just much more fleshed out and more complicated in terms of the machinations of the plot. But yeah, I was kind of surprised at just how similar it was. I mean, it was hard to read because it was all faded from the dot matrix and whatnot. I have no idea. It just got stuck into a box, and I think I'm kind of a pack rat in that sense of kind of printing out things and keeping drafts of stuff. But yeah, it was missing for all those years.
That's crazy. I'm now wondering how many listeners are nodding their head going, oh yeah, dot matrix printers, and how many listeners are going, what the heck is a dot matrix printer?
Be thankful if you don't
Yeah.
if you don't know about them. They weighed about 500 pounds, and
but they made such fun noises.
yeah, and they had the perforated sides. And
yes.
yeah.
What do you think it is about writing short stories that draws you to that type of writing?
I've written in almost every mode of writing, or every kind. I've written novels, but I love. I think what it is about the short story, I love the urgency of a short story. There's a quote. I'm blanking now on who says the quote. God, I think it's R.V. Castle. Anyways, Raymond Carver quotes it in one of his books. But he says, a definition of a short story that he really liked was that a short story is a glimpse from the corner of the eye in passing. And I love that. It gives a sense of that compression. It gives that sense of urgency. But it's not the whole story. It's this moment that we happen to see. And although some stories can be very expansive, I love the immediacy of it. I feel like there's a certain rhythm to it that when you get to page 15 or 20 or however long it is, that it can really pack a particular kind of punch for the reader that I think is more difficult than for a novel. I mean, a novel, you're living. It's much more of an investment on the part of the reader, and you're living with the characters. But it's hard to have that same cumulative effect at the end. I mean, you get like little punches here and there throughout, but yeah, there's just I think the urgency of that feeling of like, this is the story that I have to tell, or this is the story that this character has to tell. Whereas in a novel, there's a kind of, I don't want to say necessarily like flabbiness to it, but there is. There's just, it can go off on tangents. It can do all kinds of different things, but it can't maintain that sense of urgency that a short story can. And as a form, I think I understand the short story better than any. And I probably wrote about 30 unpublished short stories before I wrote my first published story. But you can't write like 30 unpublished novels. and still wake up feeling good about it.
I guess.
So,
yeah,
you could, but it'd be really disheartening and time consuming and
right.
Yeah. So so I mean, I feel like I understand it kind of intuitively better. Like a novel is still, even though I still write them, I'm still trying to wrap my head around them.
I really like that that description, the something that you see, out of the corner of your eye. I think that's one of the best descriptions of a short story that I have heard. So, thank you for that. You mentioned that there are elements of the fantastical in your stories. Can you talk about how you use that fantastical, that magical realism to impact your stories?
Sure. I mean, I would say like my stories are kind of magical realism light. It's like it's not like reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez or reading somebody who has like much more fantastical things in them, or somebody like Amy Bender, perhaps. I use it in a really, when I do use it, and not every story does it, but I try to limit it to something. It may be a big thing, like in The Magician, in terms of what happens, but that's the only moment of the kind of fantastical episode that'll happen in the story, and the rest of it kind of goes back, and then the rest of it kind of focuses on how people deal with it realistically. But I think I've always been drawn to that. I mean, I'm drawn to, when I was a college student, reading 100 Years of Solitude or reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez's short stories. And so I wanted to play with that but to try to do something slightly different in it, with it. So, I mean, it would be like a Raymond Carver story with like a little bit of fantastical element in it. So it's not, that's why I think of it as magical realism light. There's not. I would never. I would have difficulty, I think, like writing something that has a tremendous amount in it. But then I think like a lot of what I wanted in this collection was just kind of dealing with tone. So even when there are stories, like there's a story called The Blueprint of Your Brain, which is a completely realistic story in terms of everything that happens in it could happen. There's not anything that's completely outside of the realm of potential realism. But I wanted a tone in that feels like a dream, or feels like it's this journey that this character's going on that seems slightly otherworldly in some ways. So there was that I was trying to play with in some stories too. Just trying to take the reader on the same journey that the character's going through, that feels like something, even if there's nothing fantastical happening, it feels slightly fantastical. And in the first place, the first magazine I submitted that story to wrote back and said, "We don't know what this is. Is this science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it?" And that's exactly what I want you to feel. Like,
right.
Really, there's nothing vague about what happens, or there's nothing mysterious in the sense of like, what's this character doing? But I just wanted that tone.
All right, time for that second break of the podcast. When we return, John will be talking about some of the research he does for his writing. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I, as you know, am speaking with John McNally. We are talking about short stories. Now let's go ahead and talk about some research.
When you write, do you tend to like to do a lot of research? Do you like to write more from just a certain place in your own brain? How do you deal with research aspects of writing?
I think it varies from story to story. There's some stories that I've written where I did a lot of research ahead of time. In my last collection, called Ghosts of Chicago, there are a couple of stories where I needed to do the research to have some grounding before I went into it. But then when I actually write the story, it's possible that only a couple of sentences include the research. So. And I was trying to think in this particular, in The Fear of Everything, there's one story in it that was actually part of a novel that ended up not working, that I spent 7 years on. So it's like a 550-page historical novel set during the Chicago fire. And I did lots and lots of research for that. And then when it just didn't work, I gave it to my agent. My agent tried to sell it. And then a couple of years later, I went back and I looked at it and I realized what the problems were. There were just too many characters. It was too, I was kind of writing above my abilities in terms of just putting too much stuff in and trying to make it this big book that I don't think I was capable of doing at that time. But there was a backstory that was in it about a character that was growing up before the Civil War in the South. And so what I did was I just took all of her backstory out and then strung it together to see if there could be a short story. And then I began kind of building it and reshaping it into a short story. So that's a case where I'm sure that there's research in it, but it was research for a completely different book. and then I extracted that part out. And I haven't really haven't really gone through it in terms of thinking about it, in terms of research, but I'm sure there are bits and pieces of research from that period in that story. So that's kind of a little bit of an outlier, I guess.
All right. Thank you for that. What are you working on now?
So I always work on a lot of different things. It's hard for me to settle on one thing. So last year, since most of us were just locked in, I decided I've always been wanting to write a thriller, just an actual full-blown, legitimate thriller. And so last year just seemed like the perfect time to do that. So I wrote a draft, and also what I wanted to do last year was I just wanted to write a lot of stuff to have a lot of raw material to work with over the next few years. So I wrote the draft of one thriller, but then when I looked at that, and I like it, I think it has a lot of potential, but it's similar. It's not really thrillery in the way that I want it. It's not. It doesn't. So it seems very much like like a book I would have written. So with a little bit of crime in it, I guess. So then I wrote a much bigger, more complicated, more traditional thriller, and a draft of that afterwards. And so that's what I'm working on revising right now. Is that I'm also under contract for a screenplay, so I'm working on that. So those are probably the main projects right now. I've got some other projects that are like in progress that I'm trying to make decisions about whether to work on or not. But those are the novel and the screenplay are the two things that are kind of taking up most of my time.
Okay. Have you written a lot of screenplays?
Yeah, actually, I have. I've had a fair number in development and or attached to producers or attached to different people. And I've co-written with a lot of good people. But usually something kind of falls apart at some point. So, like a director's come and go, or it's hard to get casting for it, or just there's so many pieces of a puzzle that are completely out of your hands when you're doing trying to get a screenplay into production. So, but I feel good about the one that I'm working on now. Just in terms of, I think it's a production company that has a good track record of getting things into production. I like their movies that they've done, so I'm pretty optimistic about that. But one thing I'll say about screenwriting too is my first love is writing books and writing novels. Screenwriting is something where it's like I enjoy doing it. I really love the form, but I do it with almost no expectations. So it's like if I have a project that just seems better for a screenplay than for a novel, then I'll do it as a screenplay. And then if something happens with it, if it moves forward, that would be great. Like a couple of years ago, I was writing a lot of screenplays, and these were all like somebody else's ideas, but it was for a Norwegian film company. And I agreed to do it because I thought it would be interesting. And I ended up doing a lot of different things for them, things I hadn't done before. So there was lots of development projects and writing an original screenplay and trying to develop a TV show. But they paid me for it. They flew me to Norway, and I got to do some location scouting in the Arctic Circle. So it just kind of opened the doors of being able to do some things that I hadn't done, or hadn't had time to do in my life before. So in some ways that's what I guess it's like the experience of doing it, and then if it yields anything, then that's a bonus.
Right. I was actually kind of thinking that as you were talking about writing screenplays, that it has to be a different type of mindset than writing a novel. A novel may or may not get published, but it seems even more tenuous for something like a screenplay.
Yeah, I mean, the novel is really it's my project, so, and it's kind of and it may not get published, and I've certainly had books that haven't gotten published. But at the end of the day, it's I'm kind of living and dying by my own, on my own sword because by the choices I make. Whereas the screenplay is just, it's so many different people involved, and sometimes there's no logic to why things get taken and why they don't get taken, or how they move. And there's so much like serendipity, I think, involved in terms of projects moving forward or not moving forward. So, I mean, I remember a project that I had years ago that I co-written that was with a production company, and it seemed like it was starting to kind of move forward. And then there was the economic crash, the Wall Street crash, and that production company was backed by Wall Street. So, so everything just kind of, they went from making 6 or 7 movies a year to 1 or 2 movies a year. And so ours got cut. So it's like it's, I'm glad I don't put all my eggs in the basket of screenwriting, I guess. So, but that said, I do enjoy doing it.
Well, are there other of your writings, other of your books that you would like to highlight?
I think like a book. I guess one book I'll talk about is the book that came out before the short story collection. It's called The Promise of Failure. And the subtitle. Let's see if I can remember the subtitle. It's one writer's. Hold on, I have to. This is the problem. I don't remember the titles of my own books. One writer's perspective on not succeeding. Subtitles we always kind of tweak, so I couldn't remember. The Promise of Failure: One Writer's Perspective on Not Succeeding, which, but it's actually it's more of an optimistic book about looking at how to use failure or projects that don't work, or just being a writer with the frustrations of being a writer sometimes, of like figuring out how to kind of channel them into a positive, more of kind of looking at the creative process of it. So it's a weird book that I'm like, I think I'm usually fairly critical of most of my books, but I'm like really happy with this book because I think it's one of the few books that I kind of achieved what I really wanted to achieve, in the sense that but it's a weird book in terms of trying to market it or get it in people's hands. But I guess the closest I would say is it's almost like a craft memoir or craft book memoir, so that there's a lot of craft stuff in it. But I also there's a lot of I don't even want to say anecdotes, but it's like just a lot of stuff about my own life and my own experience put into the book. So that came out just a couple of years ago.
All right, thank you. Is writing something that you've always wanted to do in some capacity?
I think, since 4th grade that was kind of the start of it for me. I think I always had an internal, active internal world as a kid, just growing up, just kind of, whether it was like playing with my Hot Wheels or whatever, it's like I would have very elaborate internal stories connected with the Hot Wheel world. So, but in 4th grade, we were given an assignment to write a play and to act in it. And I was a big kid, overweight kid. And so I wrote a play about a fat superhero who goes into a phone booth to change and gets stuck because he can't get into his costume. And I acted it out. And I was like a really, really shy kid, and also really self-conscious about being a big kid. And so that was the first case of I think just being vulnerable, of getting up there and also kind of admitting something about myself. But the kids were laughing, but the teacher was laughing. And that's kind of what I was keeping my eye on, was it's like, okay, the kids are kind of an easy mark, but is the teacher going to laugh at this? And she was laughing, and I thought, okay, I've got the approval of the adults in the room. And so from that point on, I think I became really interested in writing. And in 7th and 8th grade, I wrote a book about old-time comedians that I wrote to every publisher asking if they were interested in it. I spent 2 years typing it out on a manual typewriter manual typewriter, while writing to all these old, like anybody who had been in an Abbott and Costello movie or Laurel and Hardy movie, anybody who was still alive, I was writing to them. This was in the 70s, and being surprised at how many people wrote back to me. Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, she was in an Abbott and Costello movie, and she wrote a letter, hand wrote a letter back to me. Directors wrote back to me. I mean, this was at a time, I think, like when, celebrity was different than it is now. So, these people oftentimes had just retired and were living quiet lives somewhere. And I, as a little detective, tracked them down and wrote to them. So I'd always had that, but I grew up in a blue collar family. And so it wasn't until I was in college that I actually met somebody who was a writer. It was my first creative writing teacher. And then I was like, oh, okay, this is actually, like I could teach and do this. And this is something that isn't just kind of a fantasy that I have of becoming.
Jumping in once again for one last break of the podcast. When we come back, John will be talking about he will be giving his advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author John McNally.
Out of then your own journey and the fact that you do teach creative writing, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Well, my two kind of go-to pieces of advice. One is to try to create a habit, and I think it's difficult to kind of get into that, like to access the internal world of a character if you're doing it piecemeal. But even if you do it just for like even if you have only 15 minutes a day, I think doing it consistently is better than, doing 8 hours one day and then taking a couple weeks off or a couple months and then coming back to it. I just find it it's easier to kind of tap into your unconscious mind when you're doing it every day, but it's also easier to create that kind of momentum that makes you want to keep going back to the page. I mean, it's like going to the gym. It's like the first couple of days are miserable, but if you go every day, you begin wanting to go. It's like it's triggering things in your brain that make you want to return to the gym, as opposed to like if you go one day and then you take a month off, you don't want to do it. So like creating that habit, I think, is like a good thing, having some sort of routine, even if it's just a little bit each day. And the other thing I always say is watch your overhead, because it's like the idea of like putting yourself in too much debt or taking out a lot of student loans, which I was guilty of. What I found was that it's just like time is a writer's most valuable commodity. And if you're constantly working, or, you're trying to pay bills that you racked up in college or whatever, it becomes harder and harder to find that time. And there are times in my life where I was working 3 jobs and selling plasma and I was having to wake up at 4:30 in the morning just to squeeze in 15-30 minutes of writing. So that's a piece of advice just from my own history. Like, don't do what I did. Like try to afford yourself a life where you can have some time to actually do it, so that if you have an opportunity to go to a writer's conference or a writer's retreat, you can do it, which is something I couldn't do because I usually had to work. So.
All right. Thank you for that. Slightly off topic, but I was curious about the author picture on the back of The Fear of Everything. Who drew that?
Keith Rosen. He's a fiction writer and a artist, and he so I had met him a few years ago, and I knew he used to do he does a lot of artwork for bands, whether it's CDs or posters. I think he used to do a lot of posters for punk rock shows, things like that. So anyways, he was on Facebook. He was offering, I think it was, I don't know if it was $100 a pop or something, of just doing a portrait of the person if they were interested. And then I just began, and I'd hired him to do the artwork for the book, the graphic. Just all the design work and everything. So the more I thought about it, the more I just thought, well, that would be fun to actually just, because I kind of hate doing author photos. So I asked him to do that and just to see. So it's funny because it's and he even says, it doesn't entirely look like the person, but it captures kind of the essence of the person. So, if you've seen photos of me, it kind of looks like me. Maybe not entirely, but I love it. I think it does capture a certain essence to me.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm comparing it side by side with the author picture in the press release that was sent to me with the book, and yeah, it looks like you, and it doesn't look like you. It looks sort of like the I don't know, the Breaking Bad version of you,
oh yeah,
something, the trucker version of you. I'm not really sure, but it's a very cool picture.
Well, I think and when I think about the stories, because it's the stories are, oftentimes kind of initially drawn from things that have happened to me or some aspect of real life. The lawyer was an actual conversation I had with a lawyer. About 3/4 of it was verbatim.
Ew.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And there's a sleep study in here that was pretty accurate in terms of my experience of having a sleep study. So the drawing actually for me works as this is kind of my doppelganger. This is the character version of me, who may be in the stories. Because the stories aren't really, I don't think of my stories as autobiographical per se, but they're often inspired by something autobiographical, and some are certainly more faithful to episodes of my life.
Yeah. When you take time to read for yourself, who are your go-to authors?
That's a good question, because I don't have a lot of time to read for myself anymore. I'm trying to, but I like the book I've probably returned to the most is Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road, which is a novel that I just love. I don't like the movie, but the movie isn't even close to what the novel is in terms of what it does. But I think what I love about that book is I can read it on two levels at the same time. I love the story of it, and it really just it brings me into that world so successfully. But then I'm also really conscious on a sentence by sentence level of what he's doing in terms of craft. And I can't think of very many writers who do that for me, where it's there are writers who I can be really conscious of what they're doing on the level of craft, but that distracts me from the story, or vice versa. So that's a book that I just love, and it's been a while since I've gone back to it, but that's probably the book I've read the most. Charles Portis is a writer. he wasn't a very prolific writer. His most famous book was True Grit, which was made into 2 different versions of movies. And that may be my least favorite book of his. There's a couple of books of his in the 70s. I love. They're probably the funniest books I've ever read. Just kind of deadpan, but hilarious. Margaret Atwood is somebody I go back to. Flannery O'Connor, Russell Banks. So I've begun, since I'm writing these crime novels. I've read a lot of crime fiction, but last year I've bought a ton of new thrillers just to kind of begin reading those. So that's something I'm still trying to work my way through. I have a difficult time kind of balancing reading and writing. So I've kind of front loaded. That's one thing I tell my students. It's like, while you're younger, try to front load as much reading as you can, because as you get older, life just gets in your way, and all, just daily things I have to do in addition to my writing. By the end of the day, I don't have the same energy I had when I was in my 20s or 30s as far as reading goes. So
Yep.
I still try to push forward as much as I can. So
I understand that sentiment. I don't feel like I read nearly as much as I used to. So, do you have a website and or social media where people could interact with you?
Yeah, so on Facebook I have an author page, which is at John McNally Writer, all one word. And then it's just slightly different for Instagram. It's at Writer John McNally. And those are probably the 2 best places. And those are the places where I'd be most active.
Okay. Thank you for that. We have talked about a variety of different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't covered, whether it's in terms of the book, The Fear of Everything, or writing in general, that you wanted to bring up?
No, I feel pretty happy that I think we've covered quite a bit.
All right, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to me about the collection and, all the other random questions that I threw at you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you once again to John for joining me for this interview. Again, the book is called The Fear of Everything, and the author is John McNally, in case you didn't catch that throughout the rest of the episode. I often mention the coincidences and the connections between interviews and how I'm always amazed by them. And last episode, I had a short story collection with author Heather Mateus Sappenfield, and now another short story collection. But of course, they're so very different, the short stories and the short story collections, because the authors, of course, are so very different, and they're writing from different perspectives and different places. And so even if you just read a book of short stories, it's not like you can't pick up another book of short stories, because it's going to be so very different. And just the voice in these stories and the perspective in these stories is really coming from a different place than that of the stories that Heather wrote in her book that we talked about in the last episode. And maybe that is completely obvious to everyone, but I don't know. I like that you can pick up 2 books that both say collection of short stories and have just vastly different experiences within each of those books. So thank you, John, for joining me. Thank you for voicing why short stories have always not rubbed me the wrong way, but kind of niggled at my brain a little bit in a way that I could never quite put into words. Appreciate that. I will always remember you for giving me that perspective. So thank you so much. As always, thank you to you, my listeners, for joining me. You are always appreciated as well. If you are a fan of the podcast, you've heard me say this before, but if you would be willing to help us out, a review would be great. 5 stars would be awesome, but a review would be great, whether that is written or you just give us some stars. That helps us to get the podcast out to more book lovers such as yourselves. Also, if you could follow the podcast on social media, GSMC Book Review Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Love to hear your thoughts on what you're reading. Love to hear your thoughts on author interviews. If you have read any of the books from the authors with whom I speak, etc. I like hearing from you. So please come hang out with me on social media. Please join me for the next interview when I will be speaking with author Soraya Wilson about 2 books. One is called Roommate. The other is The Seat Filler. They are romantic comedies. So we are switching gears once again, moving from short stories to romantic comedies. You know I love me some romantic comedies, and these are really fun. So definitely join me for that conversation with author Soraya Wilson. In the meantime, I hope that your week continues to go well and that it involves not only laundry that gets folded and put away, but plenty of time for you to get lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.